am inviting you into a conversation unlike any other. Yes, Susie and I talk about trauma, but we do it in an experiential way. This is not a theoretical conversation punctuated with examples, but a conversation between friends of how trauma shows up in the lives of clients and ourselves. You will learn what that looks like, what the consequences are, what you can do about it, and more. This conversation is about the human experience. It's very relatable. You're going to have light bulb moments and have plenty of takeaways from this episode. I hope you enjoy it and be prepared to rewind or re-listen to the entire episode because it's packed full of goodness just for you. Hey there. Welcome to the Burnout Isn't Necessary podcast, where we delve into the world of stress, burnout, and the science behind it all. Over a decade ago, I faced burnout as a management consultant, experiencing an emptiness that I wouldn't wish on anyone. But here's the truth. Hello, welcome back. Today I am welcoming Susie Masterson onto the podcast. Susie is an experienced trauma-informed coach and psychotherapist. Susie has featured in lots of publications, including The Guardian, The Independent, The Telegraph, Hello Magazine, The Metro, and more. I didn't list them all. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, me too. I'm really pleased to be here. I think there is loads of overlap in kind of our respective backgrounds, and I'm kind of eager to understand kind of more about how stress and the triggers and all the stuff that you work with in your mastery programs kind of intersects with my world and trauma activation.
So interestingly, Susie and I were connected. You and I were connected on LinkedIn via a mutual friend, Daryl, who made a comment linking both of us, saying that it's really interesting that we were both super high achievers, profound thinkers, change agents, seemingly, quote unquote, at the height of your powers. Shows that appearances can be deceiving, was one of his comments. And this was all because we were both talking about burnout. And then you and I got into a conversation about, in particular, the height of your powers comment that he made, because for me, it felt yes, but I felt like I was too far out there, like I was out on a limb, carrying too much. And then, yeah, we ended up in a conversation and have been in a conversation ever since about these things. So I thought it would be good to just start there and start with your experience of burnout. What did that look like? What was going on for you? What contributed to it?
Yeah, and you know that you're right, kind of out on a limb, kind of out on a tightrope is kind of how I felt, you know, that I was carrying more and more. So I'm on a tightrope and I've got like, you know, a massive army-sized backpack on my back, and the pressure of being told that you are successful, capable, change agent, innovative, all of those things that are really positive labels. And actually, let's, you know, kind of call out the gender card. Pretty good to be having as a woman in our industry or the industries that we used to work in. But oh my God, like a pedestal that is just, in my view, felt like it was ready to be toppled every day. And for me, it was really difficult because I was already working through, I kind of went to therapy at 29. And at 30, I achieved such burnout that I had to stop work. And it was quite strange because I was already in therapy and I thought, oh, hang on, you know, isn't this supposed to be the thing that is helping me? It was, but by kind of delving deep and self-inquiring and going through my own traumatic experiences that I'd had as a kid, they were all on the surface and they were then in my backpack. And then they were coming out every time I had a difficult conversation at work. There was a time I remember, to your point about kind of Daryl's comment about us, about how we appeared to everybody. There was a time I remember when I was sat outside the Bank of England on a bench, having just come up from Bank Tube Station. And I genuinely felt that I just wanted to escape the world. I couldn't cope with people chattering around me. I couldn't cope with the thought of going to a meeting, which I was, you know, half an hour having to go off to in a big insurer. And I was starting to think to myself, not only do I want to escape the noise, the pressure, the expectation, I actually don't even want to be here anymore. And then I went to a meeting and closed $1 million deal.
Wow.
And then I came out of the meeting went home, collapsed in floods of tears. And I genuinely don't know how I got home, but I know that I performed at the meeting. But it was a very kind of separate experience. It was a persona. It was the things that I knew how to do to perform, almost on autopilot. But everything else underneath was just.
As you were describing that, I was thinking that when we're in sales, so I was a consultant, but I was also involved in a lot of sales work. And you know, there's the stuff that you can do behind the scenes, but when you're in front of a client, it's very much putting on that persona. And so I think I could imagine, whilst I have never had a role that's entirely sales focused, I can imagine that wearing that persona frequently, whenever you pick up the phone to a client, etc., that could be draining. Yeah.
For sure. And your capacity just kind of diminishes every time. So an example of how being on the phone, you know, to a client, or making a new business call, or speaking to a supplier, I could barely ring a hairdresser or a beautician and cancel an appointment or make an appointment. I could barely do the phone work, as I called it, in my personal life, because I'd used my capacity at work. And it was really sort of strange, small things like that, that when you add them up, you recognize that you are burnt out from the persona, from the performance at work, and how it impacts you at home.
So how did you go from closing $1 million deals and going home and crying and not really wanting to be part of the world anymore? How did you go from that to being okay again? What did that, how long did you remain in that state of going home and crying and wishing it would all just go away?
About 6 months. And I actually had to then kind of take what I called a sabbatical, because that's what you show the world, isn't it? Right. I took a sabbatical, but that sabbatical really involved just me concentrating on getting well. So I had, I continued with the therapy, but I also started to get really in touch with myself and do stuff that I hadn't done before. Always exercised, always, I did half marathons, triathlons, things that were sponsored, involved with work, etc., etc. I think I pushed my body rather than served it. Mm-hmm. And so I got into, not in a major way, but I got into yoga, and I got into kind of walking, and I got into what mindfulness means for me, which is actually sitting there and doing a crossword or doing a jigsaw. And I started to pay attention to, I guess, investing more in myself and being more in my body and kind of respecting my body, rather than all the coping mechanisms that I would have used before. And those coping mechanisms would have been eating erratically. They would have been drinking, going out, doing all the things that we do to, I guess, consume to suppress. Instead, I was kind of thinking about, okay, if I'm going to invest in myself, what are the things that I want to put in? Like, what are the things that I want to give my bank account of me, rather than how do I want to cope with all the expectation and outcomes that people are expecting from me.
We've touched on topics that are close to my heart, with yoga and mindfulness and so on. I think I've often said that, people in burnout are just operating in their headspace, like thinking, doing, and they're so disconnected from how their body's feeling and what their body's telling them and how they really are. And your description of, going running and exercising your body, but not necessarily serving your body, I definitely resonate with that. I used to be into boxing, and I would just exhaust myself. There was a time when I exhausted myself so much I couldn't pick up bags the following day.
Yeah.
It's just ridiculous. How do you get yourself to that state? Yeah. And so, and that did switch for me, and yoga was definitely part of my recovery. I think because it's mindful, because it's not the lycra and the specific movements that we're doing in yoga. It's the fact that it is a movement of the body where your mind is in the present moment, and it is raising your awareness of how you feel. So I think that, you know, somebody else might find Tai Chi or Qigong or whatever. And like, yeah, there's never only ever one answer, but it's there in the mindfulness.
Yeah. And I think what I like to kind of say about yoga or Pilates or any kind of mindful movement, as you say, whatever that might be for somebody, is it's about the process and not the outcome. And that's very much kind of how I got myself out of my burnout, but it's also how I work as a therapist and a coach. I have sometimes people coming with goals and objectives, but really it's understanding that the process, that we go through things, we don't get past them. And so my body had to come with me to go through overcoming burnout. So it's not, you know, I got to an outcome. It's the process that's really important. And so now I'm not burnt out and now I'm feeling great, but that doesn't mean I stop with the process of the stuff that works for me. You know, like I still dry brush every morning, and I can say it's because I know what the outcome will be. Like, you know, it's going to be better and I'll have lymphatic drainage and my skin will look great. And, but it's not, it's more that I want to remind myself that I deserve to be invested in and take this time to do this mindful movement or this, you know, activity that I know will keep me okay.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, I wanted to almost applaud when you were saying that. It's about investing in yourself. And that for me, I committed to a daily practice. And I believe it's most effective in the morning, because what I was subconsciously telling myself, I didn't realize it at the time, but subconsciously committing to that and showing up and doing that, I was saying, I'm the most important thing in my life and I do myself first. And I kept showing up, and I allowed myself complete permission for that to look like anything. It could be, I'm going to show up and sit on my yoga mat and do nothing for 2 minutes. And it's only 2 minutes, but it's 2 minutes of nothing. And I made it to the mat and it counts. And then other days, you know, at the weekend, it might be an hour and a half of doing a few yoga videos or whatever I might have done, and yoga nidra and just lying there, and like anything counted, as long as it was come to the space, come onto the yoga mat. And not because it's a yoga mat, but because it's the space that I had decided I was going to dedicate to myself and spend the time doing whatever it was that I was going to do for myself. And it was so it was action first and belief came second. Belief came when I kept showing up for myself every morning. And then I realized that I am actually worth it. I'm doing this and I'm believing it. Yeah. Beautiful. I love all of that stuff. So I know that you've changed careers at some point in your life from what you were doing then. You're no longer closing $1 million deals in IT. So how did your burnout experience change the course of your life? Was it the burnout that led to the change in career, or did that happen to a different time frame?
No, it really was. Yeah. You know, I guess I've had periods of burnout, you know, like when I was kind of 29, 30, that was real kind of impactful stuff. But I then went back to, you know, a different job, but in the same sector. And I guess, you know, it was an intersection of a realization where I needed to do something different. But of course, I needed to make sure that I could make a different decision, and I had to financially support myself through making a different decision. But I think the recurrence of burnout for me, and then, you know, kind of, I've got 2 kids. I'd had my second child. And by the time I had my second child, I was already in planning mode for what happens when I exit. How much do I need to earn, save, you know, put away? How much do I need to change my life financially to be able to do that? But I didn't know what I was going to. So I knew that I wanted to stop. And then I put things in place to do that. And that was very much focused on this job is getting too much from me, and in like serving my body, it's not giving enough back to me anymore. But I didn't know where I was going to go. And what was really nice was, you know, you get those serendipitous moments when you're in a kind of state of limbo. And I got invited to join the Launchpad program at Google and become a coach and mentor for female founders in the startup program. And it was then working with female founders. So working with people for whom there was no difference between their personal life and their professional life. And that actually not being a harmful thing, that being a thing that they said, actually, therefore, we need to make sure that wellness is at the front of our agenda, that it's part of our culture, that, you know, we have room for people who are going through IVF, or they've got pregnant, or they want to, you know, take a sabbatical, and kind of to have flexibility within how they work and build a business around that to support people in those positions, to ensure that, you know, at the very least they don't burn out, but actually they thrive. That really launched me into thinking, I'm a pretty good coach, but there is so much in the world of psychotherapy that could help me be a better coach, particularly to this cohort of people. And they were such role models for me as to how I then wanted to kind of live my life, who I wanted to help, how I wanted to help, that took me off to then retraining into psychotherapy.
Wow, that sounds, yeah. As somebody who's now off doing their own thing, I can see that totally. And I've seen other entrepreneurs talk about how health needs to be at the center of everything, because if you, as an entrepreneur, if you don't have your health, then you're not going to be the best for your business. You're not and life and everything has to, it's all one, business and personal life. It's all one. So yeah, I can see where they're coming from. So what do you do now, and who do you work with now, and what do you specialize in?
So I am a psychotherapist and a coach, and I'm kind of moving my hands around because I suppose it used to be that they were separate things, that I had a coaching practice, and that was a thing whilst I was retraining to be a psychotherapist. That was the way that I made money. And then when I became a psychotherapist, I continued to kind of go down the trauma-informed practice route. So post kind of training, I then became an EMDR practitioner, and an EMDR is a trauma-informed psychotherapy approach. And it felt very much that it was important for me to keep those things separate. But a bit like the female founders with their kind of life and work, it's all the same. People didn't come to me to say, can I have this therapy, please? Or can you come and help me, you know, at work, but I only want coaching to help me at work. And, you know, or can you help me because I have stuff that is impacting my relationships, but actually I might have come because it's my partner, but it's kind of playing out with my boss. So I started to see that actually the more kind of training and experience I had on the job, the more integrated my approach became. And that I used to start off by saying, I'm wearing a coaching hat now because I felt like it was ethical to tell my therapy clients that maybe I'm going to be a bit different. Or with my coaching clients, I would bring in therapy and we would do an EMDR processing session as part of coaching, and off they'd go for an interview and wow it. And they'd be like, okay, I don't really care what you've done. I'm just really glad that things have progressed for me. So, yeah, so what I do now, I suppose, is I try and integrate both of those things, my experience as a coach and my experience as a psychotherapist, to help people feel empowered enough to make changes in their lives. I genuinely believe that everybody comes to therapy or coaching to improve their relationships, even if they don't say that to me, because that's what life's about, right? It's about how we relate both to ourselves and to everybody else around us. And the quality of our relationships absolutely impacts the quality of our lives.
So what kind of problems do people come to you with? So they're not saying I want coaching or I want you to wear a specific hat, but what do they say when they walk through your door? What do they say they're coming for?
So there are people who come with situational stuff, whether that's, you know, they've been going for promotion and for whatever reason it's not happening, or they want to transition from one career to another and kind of want guidance on how to do that. But then I have people kind of turning up saying they're finding it difficult in a particular relationship that they have, or they are finding that they're feeling particularly anxious. So there are all symptoms of kind of not feeling authentic. There's a word in psychology that we use called congruence, that there's an incongruence going on. Something isn't right. They don't like the behavior. They don't like how they feel. And whether that is external world related, i.e. the job, the partner, or it's internal world, i.e. I've noticed a pattern here. Something is coming up for me. I'm doing it again and I want to know why. And for me, it's just trying to find the right approaches, which could be a combination of coaching or different psychotherapy approaches. Sometimes we lean on one more than the other to help them best navigate that. So I guess a concise way is saying most people come when they're going through a transition, but sometimes that's an internal one, sometimes that's an external one.
I think when you were talking about the incongruence, the big one for me in burnout was on the outside, it looks like I've got everything that I wanted. I've got the house, I'm happily married. Like, why am I not happy? And I was just utterly miserable. And that for me was the big stark contrast of the internal experience of living as me for a day versus what I think everybody else was perceiving, and certainly what everybody else could see.
Yeah, that resonates. And I think another example of kind of incongruence in burnout and in the corporate world is where you'll get someone who says, you know, my family's really important to me. They're showing you their pictures on their phone all the time, or they're really proud that they go to private school, or they're doing this sport or whatever. And you're sitting with them in an airport lounge when they're doing this. And then they're kind of having a bit of a brag about the fact that they're in business class or first class because they fly so often. And I just sit there and say, but that just means you're never at home. And yet they've just shown me all the pictures of their kids, and, you know, you're never with your family. Massive incongruence there, right?
Yeah.
But we have to tell our story that being in business class is a perk, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to face the incongruence of the fact that we're not at home.
I've spoken to a couple of people recently along those lines where they say that they've come from a childhood where financially things were not as easy as they might have been, and that they might be the first in their family to go to university, the first in their family to achieve, you know, to have bought their house by an age or whatever. And so they're in a corporate job. They're now far more affluent than their parents were. And they've strived for that because family is important to them, and they want more for their kids than their parents were able to provide for them. And so they want to, you know, offer more. And so they go down this route of, I'm doing this for my family, work is for my family. And so their value and their action when they start is completely aligned. And then over time, it's work to the point where it's actually now compromising the family. And they don't kind of have a checkpoint where they realize that the family has more than enough, and now the family really needs them. And they have just perpetuated the same behavior and continued down the same path. But the path is now veering away from where they thought they were headed towards the family. And so that's also really interesting, that you can kind of establish a behavior with all of the best meaning, and you're really clear on why you're doing it, and you're aligned with your values, but that just repeating that behavior doesn't necessarily repeat alignment to the values.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you've hit on a really good example there, because that's why we have to kind of check in with ourselves. What's changed? You know, like I kind of like doing an MOT on your car, right? I always say to coaching clients, kind of ask yourself every quarter, is this still working for me? And is this still working for me in terms of my work-life balance? You know, if I have a plan, for example, that it's to earn X amount of money or put my kids through school or whatever, though that plan might be on track, what's the impact of it on me? Because context, you know, we can rationalize the story of, I am earning money for my family and I am giving them more than I had. But that's the context, that's the rationalization for it, that's the story. But the impact is, I'm miserable. I'm not seeing my kids. My kids are upset because I'm not present with them when I am available, and I'm rarely available because I'm not there. And so, you know, like in the Victorian scales, the old-fashioned scales, where you literally kind of can change the weight on it and see which way it bounces. I use that a lot with my clients to say, where are the scales at the moment, right? Where have they tipped? Because if the burden is too much, then we need to make a change.
I get approached multiple times a week by people telling me how they could help me improve the podcast. They talk about improving the audio quality, improving the editing quality, improving the listening experience, and also improving the listener numbers. And this feedback all sounds fantastic. So I'm now looking to raise funds to make some of these improvements, which is why I'm introducing some affiliate brands to the podcast. When you buy from these brands, I will receive a commission, and my intention is to directly invest that back into the podcast to make those improvements. So today, I would like to introduce a brand called Ecotex. As you will know from listening to this podcast, I am a yoga practitioner, a teacher, a yoga enthusiast, and Ecotex, which is spelled Ekotex, is a brand that is dedicated to creating naturally beautiful, ethical, and durable yoga equipment. So yoga mats and yoga props. And they're based in Scotland. They design their products to support you as the practitioner and also to support the planet in the process. And they now make a lot of their products locally in the UK, and if not, then in Europe. I use their equipment in my personal practice and also when I'm teaching. I think they offer fantastic value for money and great quality. And of course, also the peace of mind that these are eco-friendly products. So if you're interested in getting yoga equipment, I highly recommend them. And you can check out their products by clicking the link that I've included in the show notes. If you've got questions like whether or not you should be using a block for something or a bolster for something, then I am more than happy to help you with any questions that you have. So just drop me an email. And maybe put something like yoga equipment in the title, and I'll get back to you with my guidance. So thank you for your support with this. Thank you for supporting the podcast. I hope that you love the Ecotex products as much as I do. And now let's get back to the conversation.
So let's go to trauma, because you've mentioned trauma a couple of times, and I know that you practice that it's an area that you talk about as well, and it's an area that you practice in. So let's first off define what you mean by trauma.
Oh my God, what a question. And lots of people have done this better than me, so I'll be borrowing from them for sure. But for me, kind of in a really simplistic definition, trauma is something that happened in the past to us, and I'm going to put a little asterisk next to that and I'll come back to it. Something that happened in the past that still disrupts us in the present. But what the happened to us bit is important, right? Because it's not necessarily an event. It's not a car crash. It's not abuse. It's not feeling appropriately seen, heard, understood, not having someone in your corner when something went wrong. So as kids, we have all experienced little t trauma. We have all been missed. We have all been snubbed. We have all not been comforted by somebody at some point in a way that made us feel important. And those things, I have so many examples of those sorts of childhood instances that I process with clients in either talking therapy or in EMDR therapy, that we'll talk about something today at work. This is bothering me. I'm struggling to have this conversation with this person. I really need to negotiate and I can't. And we go right back to falling off the bike when you were 4 and your mum was on the phone and they completely ignored you. And you thought, I'm going to die because no one's going to come and rescue me because I've fallen off my bike and no one's paying any attention. And I'm laughing because it sounds so trivial. But you'd be surprised as to how often we go straight from here, difficult situation at work, to here, thing that happened in the past that made me feel something about myself that I have brought with me and I cannot shake it. And that will be, nobody loves me, I'm unlovable, I'm not good enough, I'm stupid, whatever the negative beliefs are, they show up all the time in the present. And that's a real, everybody, can get on board with example of how little t trauma can impact us in all sorts of situations.
I've done a lot of journaling, and I will often journal on the thing that's happening, going on in the present moment, the thing that's bothering me. And then as I journal on that, pick up on, I felt this way before. It reminds me of a time when, and it's not always just one time, because sometimes there's a bit of a recurrence. Like, well, there was a time a couple of years ago, and then there was that other time about 10 years ago, and then there was the time when I was a kid. And they've all got this theme. Yeah. And I can't remember where I was going with this, but that I find journaling very helpful to be able to see that. I don't think that everybody can see that, though. I think that's because I've done a lot of work on myself. And I've seen, I think this is where I wanted to go with it. I've seen little indicators for me that this isn't about the now. This is about something else. And there are two for me. One is I feel disproportionate. Like, my emotions to this thing are disproportionate. I am so seethingly furious, but my logical brain is saying it's not that big a deal. And emotionally, I've got this massive eruption going on. That to me is like a warning sign of, it's not just about this. It must be also about something else. And the other one is where the emotions feel slightly off. Like, I don't quite understand why I feel, I don't know what it might be, like anger or jealousy, or like it doesn't, the emotion that I'm feeling doesn't quite feel like it should do for the scenario that's panning out. It just feels slightly off. Yeah, those are the two things for me that suggest there's something, not just the now.
Well, yeah, and you kind of beautifully set me up for how I now go on to sort of describe kind of stress and trauma. So let's call stress a trigger. And what you're doing is you're noticing when you get triggered, because I know, that it might sound a bit like semantics, but language, is important and can be really helpful. When we say I feel triggered, it probably means what I'm about to say. And this is the difference between trauma and stress, right? So when we say I feel triggered, and then, like, oh, my body goes like this and I get really angry or really upset or whatever, I'm going to separate that out a bit. So what you've done with your journaling is noticed today when something happens, you've been triggered. And what you're journaling when you are noticing all the times when you have felt like that in the past, or the situation has seemed similar, or the same feelings have arisen, is noticing what gets activated in you. So a trigger you can pull, right? But if you shoot it into a pillow, feathers come out. Marvelous. If you shoot a gun into a wall, all that explosion is all the stuff that's happened to us in the past that is now activated from either little t or big T traumas that then make our response, as you say, disproportionate. And really insightful from you there as well about so that's about the proportion of our response. Like, hang on, this is like way too much for, this chat that has just made me feel really uncomfortable at work. But it's also that insight that you had about the emotion not really fitting it. So we could get really angry with somebody who is not shouting at us, who hasn't said anything, who has maybe just given us a bit of feedback or said, perhaps you'd like to consider. But the anger could come from, we've had a teacher, and it could be gender-based, and somebody has questioned our capability, our effectiveness, our intellect, whatever it might be. Or it could be that we should be angry in a situation, that somebody is literally, kicking off, shouting at us, saying something that is totally inappropriate to us, and we can't, and all we do is feel completely helpless and shut down and cry. And that's because we've gone to a part of us that has kind of been activated in this triggering situation. And so that's really what I talk about when I say that stress will activate trauma if you have it, and most of us have it, but we just don't necessarily notice the link. We actually can often walk around thinking, my response is totally commensurate to this situation. And that's when we lose all our accountability.
Yeah. When I'm talking about the stress response and what happens in the body when we get stressed, and the fact that the information that the amygdala has access to when it decides, am I safe or not safe? Am I going to trigger the stress response or not? reaches the amygdala way before it reaches our conscious brain. So the decision is made and the response is happening in real time already when the conscious brain suddenly receives the information about what's happening. And the conscious brain is trying to piece it all together. Like, this happened, like, there's the trigger, this is the response. Let's make a story to make it all make sense, because we are humans and we are meaning makers. So it's trying to piece all of this together. And of course, that means that, like, the me before all of my burnout and yoga experience and all the work I've done on myself wouldn't see that at all, and would spend a lot of time justifying my behavior, because otherwise, like, I'm crazy, you know, like, and I'm not going to explore that option. So I feel uncomfortable with my response being disproportionate or my response being inappropriate. And therefore, I'm going to create this story to make it make sense, because I don't want it to not make sense. My world becomes very unsafe if I'm not safe, like if I'm a liability. Yeah.
And that shows up, you know, it's shown up in my own life. I used to just constantly be planning to leave a job, because anytime anybody said anything to me that I didn't like, I'm not even going to say they said something terrible, right? You know, that triggered me and activated all my stuff. I just thought, oh, they're going to reject me. You know, it's not possible for them to be disappointed in me, annoyed that I've missed this or didn't ask that question. You know, it's not possible for me to be wrong, right? Or not good enough and still be okay and still be accepted and still stay in the workplace. I was never going to get fired. But I spent all the time either leaving prematurely or planning to leave prematurely, because I couldn't cope with the strength of the feelings, and I couldn't understand that was my response because of everything that had been activated in me, as opposed to it was their fault. This was a toxic environment that I couldn't possibly be in anymore. And I think, you know, you're right when you talk about, you didn't use the word, but there is a separation that actually, absolutely, the information that the amygdala gets is going to be different than the kind of, you know, lovely therapized us. But we can start to get much closer to the primary and the secondary response. You know, if we're in a car and we're a passenger and there's a near miss, we're going to do some kind of, you know, it could be it could be just a clench. It doesn't matter. There'll be an automatic response because we were in danger. The difference is our secondary response, particularly if we've got a big bag of stuff that, you know, is going to get activated, where we're feeling really sensitive and emotional and terrible things have happened to us in the past that we've, you know, not been comforted for. We'll go on, we'll stay in that state. Our body will stay in that state. We will then start to sort of see threats around. We'll probably likely have more accidents around the house, because there's suddenly a whole change in how we respond to the initial stimulus. But if we have done the work on ourselves, or we get help to do that, we can actually start to intercept. So there'll be times when I have had a conversation, or my clients are recounting conversations at work or with their partner, where it's changed from, you've done this, you made me feel like this, you know, this situation is intolerable, my job is too stressful, it's all everywhere out there that is happening to me, and I am stuck in victim mode, to then the conversation becoming, I recognize that I'm feeling angry about this, and I'm not even sure why I'm feeling angry about it, but I'm going to take some time because this is clearly a trigger for me, right? That can happen. It won't happen as the automatic primary response, but it can be a much closer secondary response. And that is so freeing.
Yeah, very empowering. And whilst I'm sure there's more to it than just mindfulness, I do find that meditation and mindfulness practice allows that microsecond of time where there's a choice in how I'm going to respond. And that microsecond of time, it didn't feel like it was there before I practiced mindfulness. It didn't feel like there was a choice. It felt like the response was it felt out of my control. It felt like it was a predetermined response to whatever the events were.
Yeah, there's an inevitability about it, right? And, you know, mindfulness, of course, really helps with that, helps with just kind of slowing down and therefore giving us the separation in the response. but so does processing in therapy. So does being able to kind of dissect our emotions and actually understand that there's a much broader range of emotions than we might realize. Often people talk about anger being kind of like an emotion that is not really the primary one, but it's kind of they do the iceberg, like, don't they? The picture of the iceberg, that anger is the thing that people see, but underneath it, here's all the kind of complex emotions that people are trying to avoid by going to anger, by using that as their first response. But I actually see it as the other way, particularly because I work with a lot of women, that it's not okay for women to be angry. I work with a lot of women who go to sadness and helplessness very quickly, and I have to help them find their anger. And so in processing together, in talking about emotions and validating all of them and understanding that there's a much broader range than we really either understand ourselves or get to show, we can then understand that we have got a much bigger selection to choose from, and all of them are okay. And that as long as we can speak of our emotions rather than always act out in them, then they are all acceptable. When I started meditating, I found rage. And at first I thought I found frustration, I'm not doing this properly. Oh, my mind's going somewhere else. All of those kind of usual distracted things. But there was a period of time where I found rage, and I was kind of getting not flashbacks like, oh gosh, I'm suddenly like pinned to the chair, but just kind of stuff like a little montage going through my head of things that I was feeling a little bit outraged about, that I had every right to feel outraged about. And I was really curious about that. And I went to my own therapy about it because I didn't want to judge myself on it. And what I realized is that sometimes meditation not only gives us that separation of how to respond differently to a trigger, it actually gives us the space to find out what we need to focus on. And I clearly needed to bring my rage out in therapy, in a safe space. But I didn't know I had it until I was still.
I think it was a Steve Jobs quote, but somebody's quote that about how mindfulness brings to your awareness the stuff that you're not necessarily aware of before. Yeah, so interesting. And mindful movement as well. Any mindful practice can do that, but I think there is something about sitting in a level of stillness and meditation that attracts it all the more. So let's loop this conversation back to burnout and how trauma and past experiences have a role to play in individuals who are at risk of burnout.
Well, I think, to kind of bring it back to the world that you and I used to work in, to the corporate world, that Esther Perel, amazing relationship psychotherapist in the States, said that we all bring our emotional dowry, they're her words, to work. That, the female founders that I used to work with had it right in that we do take ourselves to work. We take the family dynamics, whatever that means to us, whatever family setting we grew up in. We take it with us to work because that's the blueprint we have for life. That's the blueprint we have for relationships. And so everything around our attachment styles, everything around our kind of core beliefs, everything about the modeling that we had from our caregivers up to the age of 7 is coming to work with us, right? Now, with the personas that we talked about before, where we're performing in a sales or a consulting gig, no one's going to see that. But if we're feeling stressed, right, if our resilience levels, our capacity is already diminished, and we're in a stressful environment where, it's high speed, it's high octane, it's high demand, where difficult conversations are happening, we are going to revert to what we learned, what we knew, and how we oriented in our original family setting. And if that was somebody who was a peacemaker and said nothing, you'll suddenly start to get withdrawn. Or if that was somebody who was in a big family and had to literally shout to be heard, you're going to start to kind of play out those behaviors at work. And that is also an example of trauma being activated, or traumatic experiences or adverse childhood experiences being played out in a setting because we are stressed. So I think about stress as basically the potential trigger point for trauma to get activated. If it doesn't, marvelous, treat the stress. But even if we treat the stress, the trauma will have still been activated, and we can go back to work having done all the self-help things that we possibly can, and even working in a calmer environment, and the trauma will still be activated, just at a kind of lower setting on the volume. So the way I work with it is to treat that underlying stuff so that it either doesn't get activated in a stressful setting, or if it does, it's going to be a lot lower volume than it would have been if we hadn't processed it.
I kind of touched on it earlier when I was talking about my journaling experience, and you've touched on it there, that these things can play out in somebody's life like as a theme. Oh, it's always like this. My job is always to whatever. People always expect whatever from me. Like, we recreate this, or we perceive people's actions in the same way, or like we kind of create the story in our head. It's the same story that gets set up time and time again. I think that is an indicator that it's some form of trauma that somebody's experienced.
And that it sends us back to a childhood mode, because as a kid,
yes,
in a stressful situation, or, we were helpless. It was everybody else's fault, and everybody else did it to us, because we have very few levers of control. And that's why I find that, I listen to people's stories. I listen to the way that people tell narratives about their life, and you realize that you're speaking to a 9-year-old or a 6-year-old or a 12-year-old, right? They are not available as an adult anymore. And I know at that point, they've been triggered, stuff has been activated. But you can't, it's ironic, isn't it? I only work with adults, but you can't have a therapy conversation with a 9-year-old or a 12-year-old or a 6-year-old. So you have to work with them to give them enough to empower them to get themselves out of the situation they are in, but knowing that actually this 40-year-old person who's really struggling to close a deal, or, to navigate a performance review, is really a kid in a household trying to orient themselves around.
So before we wrap up, do you have any suggestions? If any of this has resonated with somebody, have you got any suggestions for what somebody should do if they are beginning to think, oh, that sounds like me?
Yeah, loads of things. I mean, you mentioned one, what I call a trigger diary. So your journaling is to actually start to write down kind of, I get triggered when, or I notice patterns in the way that I relate with people, or I notice that I get myself into certain situations and that there is a sort of consistency in that. So make a note of them, make a note of how they make you feel. And then I sometimes do, good old scaling, like any clinician would, is when I think about, this thing that's happened to me, or when these feelings come up to me, when I experience these emotions, or whatever it might be around a stressful situation, if 10 is high and 0 is low, how distressing is this for me? How distressing is that situation? How distressing is it for me to feel and experience that emotion? Because starting to map that out is really empowering in and of itself. It's bringing stuff into our awareness. What we do with that, there are a load of different options, but you would be surprised that there's so few people that actually have kind of done that map. And so often I'm doing it with them in therapy or coaching. But if they bring that to me, then we can deepen our understanding of it.
And if somebody wants to know more about you, where should they go to find out more?
Well, LinkedIn, obviously, where we got together, but my website is ultraliving.uk, and you can get in touch with me just at susie@ultraliving.uk.
Great. And I'll put links for LinkedIn and for your website in the show notes, so that anybody can get an email, or your contact details in the show notes, so anybody can contact you. Is there anything that we've missed? Is there anything that you wanted to add before we wrap this up?
I guess just that, there is so much that we can do for ourselves, and kind of that's an and. There's a thing I used to say in kind of sales, it's not and or, it's not either or. So there is so much that we can do for ourselves. And people don't have to come to therapy or coaching to be helped, because awareness and ownership of how we feel about things without judgment is something that we can practice, every day. But there are times when we need to accelerate something. And that's not just because we're in a crisis, but it's because actually we want to be able to perform better at work, because we want to be more engaged with our kids. Then come to therapy, come to coaching, because to be guided and facilitated by somebody who has experience in kind of doing this can absolutely get to change quicker. But we all process in our own way and at our own pace. And so that's totally fine.
Yeah. It's all growth, and sometimes we want an accelerated period of growth, and sometimes we can be growing on our own, and sometimes actually it's nice to just take a break from growth, but when you've got other stuff going on. So yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. We've covered topics that we've never touched on even close to in today's conversation. So I'm really grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been really good.
And that's a wrap. I hope you enjoyed listening to that conversation as much as Susie and I did recording it for you, and you've got plenty of takeaways and light bulb moments, and maybe you even want to listen to that one all over again. There's so much juiciness in this particular episode. If you'd like to connect with Susie, you can do on LinkedIn. I'll include a link in the show notes, and you can also find out more on her website, which is www.ultraliving.uk. So that's ultraliving, all one word, ultraliving.uk. Thanks for listening. Thank you for being part of Burnout Isn't Necessary. Our aim is to assist you in navigating stress and preventing burnout. If you found our conversations valuable, please consider subscribing and taking a moment to rate the podcast. Your feedback is essential. I want to hear from you. If you have questions or ideas for future episodes, share them with me. Your input can shape the content that we create. A common question I receive is where to start in managing stress, and everything starts with awareness. Stress impacts each of us in a unique way, and some stress symptoms can seem a little random, so I've created a checklist of symptoms to help you better understand how stress shows up for you. There's a link in the show notes. And a quick reminder, this podcast is presented for educational and entertainment purposes only. It's not a substitute for professional advice. Stay tuned for more episodes, and until next time, take care of yourself.